I have stayed in many different establishments during my time travelling across Eastern Europe. Hostels and motels were usually my go-to choices, as I couldn't justify spending any more than absolutely necessary on a bed and pillow. I had always marvelled at the idea of travelling alone, so I'd milked my dead-end job for all it was worth, until I had enough saved up to put in my 2 weeks' notice. I had no partner, no kids and no friends I'd regret leaving behind, so I relished in the idea of reinventing myself within an exciting new culture. I arrived in Bratislava on the 15th of April and started my trip by taking the train to the northernmost part of the country. I planned on trekking across Slovakia and Hungary and eventually reaching the coastline of Croatia, the focal point of my journey. Little did I know back then, I wouldn't even come close. Things took a turn for the worse on the 29th of April when I came across a youth hostel after my hike over the Low Tatra mountain range. I remember being surprised by the fact it offered a hot meal as well as a place to sleep. Granted, hostels don't normally provide food, so I was curious as to what kind of meal $5 would get me. It was a small establishment run by a middle-aged woman who only spoke enough English to hand me the room key. "You first to come here." Her speech was heavily reliant on pointing and gesturing. I didn't understand her at first, so I simply smiled and nodded. Once I was upstairs, I realised she had probably meant I was the first guest today, as the room was empty and all the beds freshly made. I set my backpacking equipment down by the heater and shed my wet clothes. I was planning to make my way to the nearest village in the morning and see if I could get my hands on a rain jacket. I hadn't anticipated the weather conditions to be so unforgiving mid-spring. There was a quick rat-tat-tat on the door. "1 second," I called, grabbing a t-shirt at random and making my way to the door. I was surprised to see the owner standing on the other side. "You find bed good?" she asked, peering into the room. I wasn't sure if she was asking whether I'd chosen my bed or if I found it comfortable, so I went with the most optimal answer. "Yes." "Good, good," she looked me up and down, smiling. "You like food?" I nodded. Truthfully, I had no idea what she meant, but she seemed satisfied with my response and bustled down the hallway. It was nearing 7 p.m, and no other guests had been assigned to my room, which was strange, as I'd seen many backpackers out and about during the day. There was another rap on the door. It was the woman again, carrying a plate of what looked like beef stew. "Goulash," she offered the plate to me. I thanked her and returned to the room to eat. There was no TV or any other kind of entertainment, so I had to limit myself to the view from the window, which was gradually extinguished by the setting sun. I decided to pack it in and just have an early night. After all, I had a long hike ahead of me the next day and was expecting to be on my way at first light. The night seemed to have other plans for me, however. As soon as I turned off the lights, there was an already familiar rat-tat-tat at the door. I hadn't given it much thought earlier, but it occurred to me now that I was likely the only guest in the entire building. I had stayed in at least 10 hostels prior to this one, and the managers rarely found time for their own bathroom breaks, let alone for cooking and visiting their guests. I climbed out of bed and answered the door. "Goulash good?" She smiled, but I noticed her gaze kept wandering past me and into the room. "Very good, thank you," I nodded appreciatively. "Let me return the dish, hold on a moment." I flipped the light switch on and looked over to the table I had left the plate on, but there was no sign of it. I looked around, bewildered, thinking that perhaps I had absent-mindedly placed it somewhere else, but it was gone. The woman watched me curiously from the doorway. I turned to face her, my cheeks prickling in discomfort. "I'm sorry, I must have misplaced it. I remember putting it on the table, but now it's not there." She looked perplexed, and I realised she had no clue what I was saying. "The plate from the goulash," I gestured with my hands. "It's gone." An expression of understanding appeared on her face. "Ah, yes, I take." A wave of frustration washed over me. No, you don't understand. I can't find it. It's not here." She placed her hand on my shoulder and smiled sympathetically. "I come, I take." A chill ran down my spine. I had been in the room since the moment I arrived. The door had always been within my line of sight and hadn't seen anyone enter or leave. Unless, of course, this was another misunderstanding caused by the language barrier. I wanted to believe it, but the woman didn't look as though she was expecting me to give her anything. She just stood there with her hands clasped and a smile on her face. Suddenly, I found it quite unnerving. "Well, thank you so much for dinner. I think I will go to sleep now," I said, retreating into the room and placing my hand around the door handle. "Room is warm." She cocked her head and looked at me quizzically. "Yes, everything's great. Thank you so much," I said, closing the door. At least 30 seconds had passed before I heard her walking away down the hall. I breathed a sigh of relief and returned to bed. I was dozing off when she knocked again. I recoiled in agitation and pulled the sheets over my head. I was hoping that once she realised I was sleeping she would go away, and for a minute it seemed my wish would be granted. The hallway was silent and the only sound was the rustling of leaves outside my window. Another knock. This one was louder, sharper, and implied urgency. I covered my ears and prayed for her to go away and leave me alone. I knew she was still standing there. The walls were thin and I hadn't heard her walk away. I swallowed. What was she getting out of this? What could she possibly need from me at this hour? My thoughts were interrupted by a series of loud bangs on the door. I sat up in bed at once, panic-stricken. I was shaking like a leaf in spite of the warmth. I didn't want to think about what she'd do if I failed to open the door. I was well aware she didn't need my consent to come in, and it wouldn't have been the first time she had apparently done so, but she didn't. I heard the wooden floor creak as she returned to her room at the end of the hallway. Nevertheless, I sat upright for what seemed like eternity, twitching at the slightest sound and listening for the creak of the floorboards. I don't recall lying down or falling asleep, but I know I was jerked awake by movement outside my room. I dared not stir or move a muscle. For a moment, everything was still. Then the door handle turned, causing my soul to leave my body. I shut my eyes and did my best to look like I was sleeping. I heard her enter the room, her stride light, her breathing heavy. She came to a halt at the foot of my bed and I pictured her watching me in my seemingly unconscious state. I couldn't breathe, fearing that showing any signs of life would ultimately end mine. A few seconds later I heard her turn away and walk over to the window. There was a sharp scraping sound and then an anguished weeping pierced the silence. My skin crawled at the sound. Her cries got louder and more heart-wrenching by the minute and I was struggling to keep my eyes shut. Lying still had become a tall order. My bedding was uncomfortably moist and smelled of sweat and sulphur. The realization set off the alarm bells in my mind. Sulphur? I opened my eyes to find the curtains ablaze. A pillar of smoke was rising up to the ceiling and the previously white walls were covered in soot. I sprung out of bed, alarmed. The fire had spread from the curtains to the furthermost beds and the room was enveloped in flames. The woman was nowhere to be seen, but her cries were echoing in my ears like sirens, making my hair stand on end. Instinctively I ran into the hallway, only to find that the adjacent rooms had been subjected to a similar fate. The air was thick and heavy, and the smoke was burning my eyes and throat raw. I fled down the stairs to the front door. The fumes were making my head spin and forcing me into a dreamlike state. The woman's sobs had quietened down, and the only thing I could hear was the popping of sizzling wood. They found me the next morning lying on the stained grass like roadkill, in nothing but my underwear. The building had been burnt to cinders, leaving behind nothing but the foundation of what once was. I was taken in for questioning at the local police station. I explained my backpacking endeavours and how I'd come across the hostel by chance. I told them about the owner and the strange incidents that had taken place during the night and why I had reason to believe she had been the one to cause the fire. The officers listened to my entire account without interruption. When I was done, they exchanged glances and nodded to each other. The younger officer sat down beside me and gave me an uneasy smile. "I am sorry to hear of your distress. The incident you're describing is undoubtedly traumatic," he took a deep breath. "However, your account of the event shows significant discrepancies in comparison to ours." I looked at him incredulously. "How so?" He leaned forward ever so slightly and lowered his voice. "Because the establishment in question burned down 9 years ago."